My name is Reagan Hall. I am a 31-year-old major and an F-35A Lightning II pilot in the United States Air Force. And the most devastating moment of my life didn't happen in a cockpit at 30,000 feet, but while sitting at my scarred oak desk in a windowless, sterile office at Luke Air Force Base. The air in the room smelled faintly of ozone industrial floor wax, and the lukewarm remains of a Starbucks blonde roast that had long since gone cold in its ceramic mug. I was reviewing flight telemetry data on my dual Dell monitors when the haptic buzz of my iPhone 15 Pro Max fractured the silence of the room. It was an Instagram notification, a bright red bubble that felt like a tripwire. I tapped the screen with a thumb that still bore the faint grease stains from a pre-flight inspection, and my breath simply stopped. There was my younger sister, Belle, 24 years old and glowing with a radiance that looked expensive, draped in the intricate lace and silk tulle of a $12,000 VERA WANG gown from the current season's bridal collection. She was standing in the manicured gardens of the Ashford Estate in New Jersey, a venue that costs a minimum of $30,000 just to secure for a Saturday. My mother had captioned the photo with the words, "The most perfect day for our perfect girl," accompanied by a string of sparkling heart emojis. I felt a cold, sharp sensation crawl up my spine, a familiar ghost of the exclusion I had lived with for 3 decades, but this was a new level of erasure. I wasn't just missing from the bridal party or the guest list, I hadn't even been told the date existed. I scrolled through the comments with a sickening compulsion, seeing my aunt ask, "Where are you watching from and what time is it for you, Reagan?" Which proved that the narrative they had spun for the extended family was that I was too busy defending the country to attend, rather than the truth that I was never invited. I looked down at my flight suit, the Nomex fabric a stark, functional olive drab compared to the ethereal ivory of Belle's dress, and I realized that to my parents, I was nothing more than a reliable ghost, a shadow that sent monthly wire transfers of $1,500 to help with my father's medical debts, which I now realized had likely funded the open bar at this very wedding. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed at a frequency that seemed to vibrate in my teeth as I stared at my mother's smiling face in the background of the shot, wearing a navy blue Oscar de la Renta sheath dress that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment on the small house I owned in Glendale, Arizona. I have spent my entire adult life being the one they called when the water heater burst or when my brother needed bail money, yet I was deemed too unpolished, too utilitarian, or perhaps just too inconvenient to be present for the crowning achievement of the family's golden child. The injustice of it didn't just hurt, it reconfigured the way I saw my own history, turning every childhood memory of being left behind into a precursor for this ultimate betrayal. I sat there in the silence of the base, the distant roar of a Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine testing on the flight line echoing in the distance, and I understood that the family I had been protecting and supporting didn't actually exist. They were a curated image in a high-end garden, and I was the person they used to pay for the frame. I looked at the digital clock on my taskbar 1422, and realized that while I was calculating fuel loads and G-force tolerances, the people who shared my blood were clinking crystal flutes of Veuve Clicquot and celebrating a life that intentionally had no room for me in it. Family isn't supposed to be a hierarchy where the useful are discarded once their utility is exhausted, but as I sat in that sterile office, the weight of my rank and my achievements felt like lead, because none of it was enough to buy a seat at a table that was built with my own money. The financial disparity between my life and the one I've bankrolled is a bitter pill that tastes like copper and swallowed pride every time I turn the ignition of my vehicle. I walked out of the squadron headquarters and headed toward the back of the asphalt lot where my 2012 silver Honda Civic sat baked under the relentless Arizona sun, its clear coat peeling in jagged patches like sunburnt skin and the odometer frozen at a staggering 180,432 miles. The interior smelled of old upholstery and the faint metallic scent of the flight line, a stark contrast to the leather-scented luxury I knew my sister was currently inhaling. I pulled out my phone and opened my Mint budgeting app, staring at the cold, hard data of my own exploitation, which revealed that over the last 4 years, I had funneled exactly $42,340 into the black hole of my family's demands. I could see the line items flashing before my eyes like a technical failure on a cockpit HUD. The $8,500 for my mother's knee surgery copays at the Mayo Clinic, the $3,200 for the heavy-duty transmission repair on my father's Ford F-150, and the endless stream of tuition gaps for Belle's supposed marketing degree that never seemed to result in a diploma. While I was wearing a faded, sweat-stained Nomex flight suit with frayed Velcro patches and scouring the clearance racks at the base commissary for generic brand pasta and canned tuna, Belle was posting TikToks in $900 Gucci Brixton loafers and carrying a Saint Laurent envelope bag that cost more than my monthly mortgage. It was a special kind of masochism to remember the day I sat in a cramped, fluorescent-lit office at a Wells Fargo in Weehawken to co-sign the lease on her luxury condo, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River that I had never been invited to visit. She calls herself a professional influencer, a title that apparently translates to spending my hard-earned hazardous duty pay on Arohan smoothies and Pilates memberships while treating me with the clinical detachment of a bank teller handling a routine transaction. To Belle, I am not a sister or a person with my own dreams of a debt-free life or a reliable car. I am a faceless utility company, a source of liquid capital that she taps into whenever her aesthetic lifestyle outpaces her actual income. I remembered the last time we spoke, a 3-minute phone call where she didn't ask about my deployment or the stress of my command, but instead complained that the $500 I'd sent for her birthday was a bit tight, considering she had her eye on a specific pair of Prada sunglasses for a brand collaboration. I looked at my hands, the knuckles scarred from working on engines and the skin toughened by the dry heat of the desert, and I realized that every cent of that $42,000 was a piece of my freedom I had willingly handed over to people who wouldn't even give me a courtesy call to tell me they were celebrating a wedding. The air conditioning in the Civic groaned, blowing a pathetic stream of lukewarm air against my face as I sat there in the sweltering heat, realizing that I had built a golden pedestal for a sister who looked down on me from the height I had paid for. My family didn't love me. They loved the stability my sacrifice provided. And the moment I stopped being a lucrative resource, I became an invisible ghost in their polished, filtered world. In their eyes, my worth was measured in wire transfers and cleared checks, and as I watched the wedding photos continue to populate my feed, I felt the final tether of obligation snap with the cold, mechanical precision of a landing gear locking into place. The cold calculation of my erasure was finally laid bare when I received a frantic, guilt-ridden screenshot from a second cousin who had accidentally been added to a bridesmaid group chat titled Belle's Dream Day. My vision blurred as I stared at the glowing blue text bubbles on my screen, specifically a message from my mother, Diane, sent 3 months ago to the lead wedding planner at the cloister at Sea Island in Georgia. "Don't send an invite to Reagan," the message read with a clinical lack of affection. "Her military vibe will ruin the soft aesthetic of the coastal theme. She's just too masculine for the ethereal vision we've spent $60,000 to create." The words felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus, sharper than any G-force I had ever pulled in a vertical climb, because my mother hadn't just forgotten me, she had actively curated my absence to protect the visual integrity of a $25,000 a night resort setting. I sat in my darkened living room in Arizona, the only sound being the hum of my refrigerator and the distant whistle of the wind against the eaves, while I watched a leaked video clip of the reception dinner. There they were, gathered under a canopy of weeping willows draped in thousands of dollars of fairy lights, clinking crystal flutes filled with $400 bottles of Louis Roederer Cristal champagne. My father, whose blood pressure medication I had paid for just 3 weeks ago, was laughing heartily as he toasted to the perfect family, his face flushed from the expensive vintage and the warm Georgia salt air. Belle was a vision in her silk tulle, her skin glowing under the professional lighting that probably cost more than my annual flight pay, looking like a porcelain doll that had never known a day of labor or a moment of financial anxiety. The irony was a jagged shard in my throat because the very comfort they were basking in, the very aesthetic they feared I would tarnish, was built upon the foundation of my sacrifice. Every time I had pulled an extra shift, every time I had stayed in the barracks instead of a hotel to save money to send home, and every time I had worn my tattered flight suit for another year to avoid buying new clothes, I was inadvertently funding this exclusion. They were sipping $400 champagne while I was calculating if I could afford to replace the dry-rotted tires on my Honda this month. I watched my mother smooth the skirt of her navy Oscar de la Renta gown, her expression one of pure, unadulterated triumph, completely indifferent to the fact that her eldest daughter was 3,000 miles away, mourning a relationship that had been a one-way street for a decade. The coastal theme required a certain softness, a certain effortless grace that my scarred hands and rigid posture apparently threatened to shatter, as if my service and my strength were stains on their curated masterpiece. I realized then that I wasn't a daughter to them, I was a silent benefactor, a line item in their budget that was meant to be seen in the ledger but never at the table. The betrayal wasn't just the lack of an invitation. It was the realization that my mother viewed my entire identity, my career and my service to this country as a stylistic flaw that needed to be edited out of her life. As the video looped and the sound of their laughter filled my quiet kitchen, I felt a profound, icy clarity settle over me. The soft aesthetic they loved so much was paid for with my hard, unpolished reality, and for the first time in my life, I understood that the only way to stop being a ghost in their world was to stop being their ATM in mine. Family is supposed to be the one place where you don't have to fit an aesthetic to be worthy of a chair, but Diane had made it clear that her love was conditional on a dress code I would never care to follow. The digital clock on my bedside table flickered 2:45 a.m. in a harsh, bleeding crimson as I sat hunched over a scarred wooden desk in the oppressive silence of my quarters. The only light in the room came from a single high-intensity LED desk lamp that cast long, skeletal shadows across the walls, illuminating a yellow legal pad that was rapidly filling with the cold, mathematical evidence of my own exploitation. I gripped a matte black Fisher Space pen so tightly my knuckles turned a ghostly white, my hand moving with the mechanical precision of a flight computer as I logged every wire transfer, every Zelle payment, and every emergency credit card bailout I had facilitated since I earned my wings. The numbers were staggering, a relentless march of thousands that added up to a grand total of $112,890, a fortune built on the back of my youth and the hazardous duty pay I earned while dodging surface-to-air threats in airspace that smelled like cordite and jet fuel. While I was squatting in the dirt of a forward operating base, tearing open a plastic pouch of a lukewarm vegetable cracker emery and dreaming of a home that didn't exist, they were sitting in climate-controlled boutiques in Manhattan, sipping artisanal sparkling water and picking out the heavy, cream-colored cardstock for a royal wedding I wasn't even invited to attend. I looked at the total circled at the bottom of the page, the ink still wet and glistening like a fresh wound, and suddenly the hot, stinging tears that had been blurring my vision simply evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, predatory focus. The grief that had been a heavy stone in my chest for the last 3 hours transformed into a sharp, jagged shard of ice, and my eyes went cold with the same detached intensity one used when locking a target on a thermal imaging sensor. If my mother and Bal wanted me to be an invisible ghost, then I would grant them their wish. But I would no longer be the benevolent spirit that kept their lights on and their wine glasses full. I realized with a jarring absolute clarity that love was no longer a currency I was willing to trade in, because the exchange rate had become ruinous, leaving me bankrupt while they thrived on the interest of my misery. I stood up, the Nomex of my flight suit rustling in the quiet room, and walked over to the window to stare out at the darkened flight line where the silhouettes of the F-35s looked like sleeping predators waiting for the dawn. The woman who begged for a crumb of affection and a seat at the family table died at 2:45 a.m., replaced by a major who understood that if I was to be a shadow in their lives, I would be the kind of shadow that eclipses their sun and leaves them shivering in the dark. I reached for my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keys with a newfound sense of purpose as I began the process of decoupling my life from theirs, starting with the immediate revocation of the co-signed lease and the freezing of the supplemental credit cards that bore my name but were swiped for their luxury. Every cent I had ever sent was a brick in a wall they built to keep me out, and now I was going to take those bricks back, one by one, until their gilded world collapsed under the weight of its own vanity. Family is a bond that requires mutual respect, but business is a transaction that requires payment, and as of this moment, the Hall family's credit has been permanently revoked. I am done being the reliable one, the one who fixes the mistakes of the beautiful people. From now on, I am the storm they never saw coming on their perfect coastal-themed horizon. The air in the mahogany-paneled office of Marcus Thorne was thick with the heavy, opulent scent of hand-rolled Cohiba Behike cigars and the sharp, acidic bite of $300 an ounce Kopi Luwak espresso that hissed from a polished copper machine in the corner. I sat on the edge of a buttersoft Italian leather chair, my spine as rigid as a flight control rod, while Marcus adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles and began to spread the paper trail of my family's betrayal across a desk carved from a single slab of ancient black walnut. Beside him sat Elias Vance, a forensic accountant with eyes like cold flint who had spent the last 72 hours dissecting my bank statements and credit history with the surgical precision of a coroner performing an autopsy on a crime victim. We were gathering what Marcus called the arsenal, a mountain of legal munitions that included every signed loan agreement for Bell's Hudson River condo, The original titles to the 2024 BMW X5 my parents drove, which were still technically in my name for insurance purposes, and the itemized receipts for the $30,000 wedding deposit I had unknowingly authorized through a power of attorney I'd signed when I was deployed to Al Udeid. As Elias flipped through a thick binder of red-inked spreadsheets, the sickening reality of my situation crystallized into a sharp, jagged truth that cut deeper than any insult my mother had ever hurled. Belle's entire dream life, the one she curated for her 300,000 followers with such effortless grace, was not built on her talent or her influence, but on a crumbling foundation of my personal debt and the high-interest credit lines she had drained while I was 10,000 miles away. I looked at a specific line item for an $8,000 Dior haul that had been flagged as an emergency dental expense in our shared family ledger, and I felt the last lingering warmth of sisterly affection turn into a cold, predatory resolve. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the light catching the silver at his temples as he explained that because I was the primary signatory on the lease and the sole owner of the vehicle titles, I held the nuclear codes to their entire social existence. Every luxury they flaunted, the imported marble countertops in the condo, the heated leather seats in the SUV, even the very wedding dress Belle was currently wearing in her Instagram stories, was a liability that I could trigger at a moment's notice. I realized then that my family didn't just ignore me. They had systematically harvested my credit score and my military benefits to subsidize a lifestyle they could never afford on their own. The forensic report showed that my father had even been skimming from the property tax escrow account I set up for their house to pay for his club memberships and top-shelf bourbon. As I stared at the documents, the soft aesthetic of their coastal wedding seemed to dissolve into a series of fraudulent transactions and breached contracts that smelled of desperation and vanity. Marcus handed me a fountain pen that felt heavy and balanced in my hand, its nib glistening with dark blue ink, and told me that we could begin the process of reclamation whenever I was ready to pull the trigger. I looked at the photo of Belle laughing with a glass of champagne in her hand, knowing that the very ground she stood on belonged to me by law, and I felt a dark, satisfying sense of power settle into my bones. They wanted a ghost, but they were about to find out that a ghost can haunt a bank account just as easily as a house, and I was prepared to be the most expensive nightmare they ever encountered. This wasn't about a wedding anymore. It was a hostile takeover of a life I had mistakenly thought was shared, and as I signed the first cease and desist order, I knew that the bill for their perfect day was finally coming due. Family is a bond of trust, but when the trust is forged in fraud, the only language left to speak is the cold, hard dialect of litigation and repossession. The air inside the New Jersey Botanical Gardens Great Hall was thick with the cloying, overbearing scent of $15,000 worth of imported white orchids that cascaded from the vaulted ceilings like frozen waterfalls. This was Belle's pre-wedding gala, a meticulously staged performance for 120 members of the tri-state elite, including the Langfords, her future in-laws who sat at the head table looking like they were carved from old money and inherited disdain. I stepped through the arched limestone entryway and the atmosphere seemed to shift instantly, the ambient hum of polite conversation and the delicate clinking of silver against fine bone china faltering as I made my entrance. I wasn't the disheveled pilot in a salt-stained flight suit they expected me to be. Instead, I was armored in a $3,500 midnight blue Alexander McQueen wool blend blazer with sharp, architectural shoulders and matching cigarette trousers that fit like a second skin. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, low bun that showed off the cold shimmer of diamond studs, and my 4-inch John Vito Rossi stilettos struck the polished white marble floor with a rhythmic, lethal precision that sounded exactly like a countdown timer echoing through a silent hangar. Every head in the room turned as I bypassed the check-in desk, my presence a dark, polished anomaly in a sea of pastel silks and airy chiffon. I saw my mother, Diane, freeze mid-sip of her sparkling water, her glass trembling just enough to send a ripple through the lemon slice as she stared at the daughter she had tried to edit out of her reality. Belle was standing near a towering ice sculpture of a swan, laughing at something the elder Mrs. Langford had said, but the laughter died in her throat the moment our eyes locked across the expanse of the floral-drenched room. She looked ethereal in a cream-colored silk slip dress, but against the sharp, military-grade intensity of my tailored suit, she suddenly looked fragile and unfinished, a sketch of a person compared to the reality of the woman who had paid for the very floor she was standing on. I didn't stop, I didn't wave, and I didn't offer a conciliatory smile to the aunts and cousins who gasped in the periphery of my vision. The clicking of my heels was the only sound in the sudden vacuum-like silence as I marched toward the head table, the weight of the legal documents in my slim leather clutch feeling like a loaded sidearm. I could see the confusion on the faces of the Langfords, wealthy venture capitalists who valued discretion and strength, as they tried to place me in the narrative Belle had spun of a sister too busy and too unrefined to attend. My father made a half-hearted move to stand, his face flushing a deep, guilty crimson that clashed with his expensive tuxedo, but I cut him off with a single icy stare that rooted him to his rented velvet chair. I reached the center of the room, standing directly under the glow of a Swarovski crystal chandelier that cost more than my first 2 years of officer pay, and I felt a sense of absolute terrifying calm. The botanical garden was a masterpiece of artificial beauty, a curated sanctuary of white petals and soft lighting designed to hide the ugly cracks in my family's foundation, but I had arrived to be the earthquake. As I stood there, the midnight blue fabric of my suit catching the light like the sky at dusk, I realized that the soft aesthetic they fought so hard to protect was about to be shattered by the very person they thought they could bury in the shadows of a desert airbase. I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to settle an account that was 3 decades overdue, and as the Langfords leaned forward in curious anticipation, I knew that Belle's perfect night was about to become the most expensive lesson of her life. Family is a sanctuary until it becomes a cage, and I had finally decided to tear the bars down with the same calculated precision I used to break the sound barrier. I walked with a slow, predatory deliberate pace toward the head table just as the first clink of a silver spoon against a crystal flute signaled the start of the evening's toasts. The silence that followed my path across the botanical garden was deafening, a vacuum of sound so absolute that I could hear the faint hum of the climate control systems struggling against the humid New Jersey night. My mother, Diane, leaned in as I approached, her face a frantic mask of powdered foundation and forced smiles as she hissed under her breath with a venom that didn't reach her eyes, "Reagan, leave this instant, you are absolutely embarrassing us in front of the Langfords." I didn't even grant her the courtesy of a glance, my eyes fixed forward on the podium where a wireless Shure microphone sat nestled in a bed of white hydrangeas. I reached out and took the device with a steady, gloved hand, the weight of the cold plastic familiar and grounding as I stepped into the center of the spotlight that was meant for Belle's perfection. I didn't scream, I didn't let my voice crack with the decades of resentment simmering in my marrow. Instead, I spoke with the resonant, bone-deep authority of a commanding officer addressing a flight line. "Good evening, everyone," I announced, my voice amplified by the $10,000 Bose surround system until it echoed off the vaulted glass ceiling like a sonic boom. I saw the elder Langfords sit up straighter, their practiced expressions of polite boredom sharpening into genuine startled interest as they took in my midnight blue McQueen suit and the sheer gravity of my presence. "I have a wedding gift to present to the happy couple," I continued, pausing just long enough to let the anticipation thicken into a physical weight in the room. Belle's face drained of color, her hand trembling so violently that the champagne in her glass threatened to spill onto the ivory silk of her dress, but I remained an island of glacial calm in the middle of her storm. I wasn't the unrefined military ghost they had lied about to their elite guests. I was the architect of their current reality, and I was about to show them exactly what happens when you try to build a palace on a foundation of stolen labor. My father's grip on his napkin tightened until his knuckles were white, his mouth opening as if to protest, but the sheer command in my posture silenced him before he could utter a single syllable of his practiced denial. I looked out over the sea of faces, the 120 guests who represented the pinnacle of the social circle my family had bled me dry to join, and I felt a sense of crystalline purpose. This wasn't a tantrum or a plea for attention, it was a tactical strike delivered with the same surgical precision I used to navigate a complex battle space. The gift I was about to give wasn't wrapped in silver paper or tied with a satin bow. It was the cold, hard truth of the $112,890 that had bought the very chairs they were sitting on. I stood there, a major in the United States Air Force, finally taking my place at the head of the table not because I was invited, but because I owned the table itself. Family is a bond of blood, but when that blood is treated as a line of credit, the only thing left to do is foreclose on the debt in front of everyone who ever doubted your worth. As I raised the microphone one last time, I saw the reflection of the Swarovski chandelier in Belle's panicked eyes, and I knew that the soft aesthetic of her perfect life was about to be burned away by the white-hot light of my reality. I had spent my life being the reliable shadow, but tonight, The shadow was stepping into the light to reclaim everything that had been stolen in the name of a perfection I was never allowed to share. The transition from silent benefactor to public executioner was seamless as I signaled to Marcus Thorne's associates, who emerged from the shadows of the botanical garden's limestone pillars carrying stacks of heavy manila envelopes that looked like official government dossiers. I began walking between the circular tables, each draped in $500 Belgian linen, and personally dropped an envelope in front of the most influential guests, including the Langfords, who stared at the weighted paper as if it were a live explosive. The sound of tearing cardstock rippled through the room, a jagged cacophony that replaced the soft string quartet music as people pulled out not wedding favors or glossy photographs, but crisp, black and white copies of a notice of foreclosure for Belle's Hudson River condo and the formal revocation of financial support documents prepared by my legal team. I returned to the center of the floor, the microphone still steady in my hand, and looked directly at my mother, whose face had turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray under the botanical garden's spotlights. Since I was informed by my mother via a leaked group chat that my military vibe wasn't aesthetic enough to warrant an invitation to this guest list, I could only conclude that my money wasn't aesthetic enough to continue paying for your lifestyle, I announced, my voice echoing with a cold, rhythmic precision that silenced every whisper in the building. I watched Belle's future father-in-law adjust his glasses to read the line item detailing the $42,000 in tuition and luxury expenses I had covered, his brow furrowing in the kind of clinical disgust that only a man of his stature reserves for social climbers caught in a lie. Effective at 0800 hours tomorrow morning, every bank account I have funded for this family is closed. The co-signed lease on the apartment is being terminated for breach of contract, and the titles to the vehicles currently parked in the valet lot will be recovered by my recovery agents, I continued, the words falling like iron shutters in the floral-scented air. The Langfords looked at Belle not as a daughter-in-law, but as a liability, a fraudulent investment they had been tricked into endorsing, while my sister's mouth worked soundlessly like a fish gasping for air in a dried-up pond. My father tried to stand, his face a roadmap of broken capillaries and panicked entitlement, but the sheer weight of the evidence in the hands of his peers kept him pinned to his chair as if the air itself had become leaden. I have spent $112,890 to buy a seat at a table I was never allowed to sit at, but tonight I am finally realizing that I don't need a seat at a table that is rotting from the inside out, I said, the finality of the statement ringing through the hall like a gavel. I saw the elder Mrs. Langford slowly set her champagne glass down and push it away from her, a silent social excommunication of my family that was more devastating than any physical blow I could have delivered. I had been the shadow that kept them warm for a decade, the invisible engine that powered their vanity, but by the time the sun rose over the Ashford estate, they would finally understand the true cost of the light they had stolen from me. Family is a bond that requires honesty, and since this family was built on a foundation of my debt and your deception, I am officially declaring this partnership bankrupt. I turned on my heel, the midnight blue silk of my McQueen suit shimmering under the Swarovski crystals one last time, and walked out of the botanical garden while the first sounds of real, unedited chaos began to erupt behind me. The clicking of my heels on the marble was the last thing they heard, a steady, metronomic beat that signaled the end of their perfect day and the beginning of my long-overdue freedom. The gasp that rippled through the great hall was not a singular sound, but a jagged wave of collective realization that crashed against the marble walls and echoed back in a deafening hiss of whispered judgment. I watched Victoria Langford, a woman whose family name was synonymous with Connecticut steel and generational wealth, reach out with a manicured hand to snatch one of the manila envelopes from the table as if it were a contaminated specimen. Her eyes, sharp and unforgiving behind designer frames, scanned the forensic audit I had provided, her mouth tightening into a thin, bloodless line as she realized that her future daughter-in-law was not the refined heiress of a quiet family fortune, but a fraudulent social climber living on the hazardous duty pay and military salary of a sister she treated like a servant. Belle's face, which had been a masterpiece of $400 professional airbrushing and luminous highlighter just an hour ago, turned a ghostly, translucent white that made the heavy layers of makeup look like a cracking plaster mask as she began to hyperventilate in short, jagged gasps. The humidity of the botanical garden seemed to suddenly weigh 1,000 pounds, and I saw a bead of sweat ruin the perfect contour of her cheek as the carefully constructed illusion of her life evaporated under the harsh LED spotlights of the venue. Trent, her fiancé, stood frozen beside the towering white orchid centerpiece, his hand trembling as he gripped the itemized $65,000 debt list that Marcus Thorne had documented with lethal accuracy. He looked at the line for the $12,000 VERA WANG gown he thought her parents had bought, then at the $3,000 monthly lease for the condo I had co-signed, and I saw the exact moment the love in his eyes was replaced by the cold, calculating survival instinct of the ultra-rich. He didn't offer her a hand to steady her or a word of comfort. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step away from her, the distance between them growing into a canyon of social ruin that no amount of filtered Instagram posts could ever bridge. My mother tried to reach for Victoria's arm, her voice a desperate, warbling plea for understanding, but Mrs. Langford recoiled with a look of such profound social disgust that it felt like a physical slap to the entire Hall bloodline. The elite guests, the people Belle had spent years courting with my money and my sacrifices, began to turn their backs with the coordinated precision of a school of fish sensing a predator in the water. I stood at the exit, the weight of the microphone still warm in my palm, and I felt no pity for the girl in the expensive white dress who was now shaking so violently that the silk tulle of her gown rustled like dead leaves. She had wanted a coastal aesthetic, a life of soft edges and high-end filters, but she had forgotten that a life built on a lie is just a house of cards waiting for a single gust of truth to blow it all down. I had been the foundation for 31 years, the silent, invisible force that held their world together. And as I watched Trent Langford take a second step back and adjust his tuxedo jacket as if shaking off a stain, I knew that the foundation had finally crumbled. The botanical garden, with its $15,000 in orchids and its Swarovski chandeliers, felt like a tomb for a dream that was never earned, and as I turned to walk into the cool night air of the Georgia coast, the only thing I felt was the incredible weightless freedom of a debt that had finally been settled in full. Belle's hyperventilating sobs were the last thing I heard before the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, a sound that signaled the end of my tenure as the family bank and the beginning of my life as a woman who finally belonged to herself. Family is supposed to be the one place where you are safe from the world, but when your family is the world you need to be safe from, the only way to win is to walk away and let the ruins settle behind you. The systematic dismantling of their artificial paradise occurred with a cold, kinetic efficiency that would have made a logistics officer weep with envy. Within 72 hours of my departure from the botanical garden, the Langfords issued a press release to their social circle that read like a death warrant for Belle's reputation, citing irreconcilable differences in character and immediately canceling the six-figure wedding contract with the Ashford estate. I sat in my quiet apartment back in Arizona, the dry desert wind whistling through the vents, and watched as Belle was forced to pack her $900 Gucci loafers into cheap cardboard boxes and move back into our parents' cramped three-bedroom ranch house in a suburb of New Jersey that she had spent years mocking for its lack of aesthetic appeal. However, the true masterstroke of my reclamation was not the public humiliation at the gala, but a forgotten legal maneuver I had executed 6 years ago when my father was facing a tax lien he couldn't handle. I had quietly purchased 60% of the deed to that family home in exchange for clearing his IRS debt, a fact they had tucked away in the back of their minds as a mere formality of my reliability. While Belle was sitting on the faded floral sofa of her childhood, likely hyperventilating over her plummeting follower count and the loss of her Langford-funded future, my attorney Marcus Thorne was hitting the send button on an automated legal notice that shattered their last sanctuary. My parents received a formal email at precisely 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning from Thorne and Associates, informing them that as the majority shareholder of the property, I had officially listed the house on the market through a high-volume real estate firm. The subject line was a clinical icy sting that read notice of intent to sell and demand to vacate, and the body of the text gave them exactly 30 days to clear out their decades of hoarded entitlement and find a new place to live that didn't depend on my military salary. I imagine my mother, Diane, staring at her laptop screen in that kitchen with the chipped laminate countertops I had promised to replace before I realized she didn't love me, her hands shaking as she read the bolded requirement to vacate the premises by the end of the month. The house was already live on Zillow, listed for $480,000, and the professional staging photos I had authorized made their home look like a stranger's property, a sterile and profitable asset rather than a place of memories. There was no room left for negotiation or the tearful, manipulative phone calls they tried to place to my command. I had blocked their numbers and routed all communication through Marcus, who charged them $400 an hour just to leave a voicemail. They had spent 30 years treating me like a ghost that existed only to haunt their bank accounts with deposits. But now they were finding out that a ghost can also evict you from the only world you know. I had provided the roof over their heads, the clothes on their backs, and the very ground they walked on, and now that I had pulled the rug out from under them, they were finally falling through the empty space of their own making. Belle was no longer an influencer in a $12,000 gown. She was a 24-year-old with no degree and a pile of credit card debt she couldn't outrun, huddled in a house that was legally being sold from under her feet. As I looked at the confirmation of the listing on my monitor, I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the math of self-respect. Family is the foundation you build your life on, but when that foundation is termite-ridden and parasitic, the only way to save the structure is to burn it down and start over on your own terms. I was no longer the reliable daughter who paid the price for their perfection. I was the owner of the deed, and the 30-day countdown was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. My iPhone 15 Pro Max became a frantic, pulsing siren of desperation in the days that followed, the screen constantly lighting up with a staggering 142 missed calls and a relentless deluge of "I am sorry" texts that moved from gaslighting to begging with pathetic speed. I watched the notifications scroll by while sitting in my quiet kitchen, seeing my mother's name flash 20 times in a single hour, followed by Belle's frantic paragraphs about how she was essentially homeless and how the Langfords were suing her for the engagement ring deposit. I didn't open a single one. Instead, I navigated to the settings and executed a mass block on every number associated with the Hall name, the digital silence that followed feeling more luxurious than any silk gown. With the clinical efficiency of a tactical withdrawal, I oversaw the final liquidation of the assets I had reclaimed, watching as the Hudson River condo was stripped of its designer staging and sold to a venture capitalist who didn't care about Belle's curated aesthetic. After the mortgage was settled and the legal fees for Marcus Thorne were deducted, I stood in my lawyer's office and looked at a wire transfer confirmation for exactly $89,412 in pure, unencumbered profit. It was the physical manifestation of every hour of hazardous duty, every missed holiday, and every cent of the $112,000 I had originally donated to a family that didn't exist. I didn't put it into a savings account for a rainy day or a future emergency for people who wouldn't even invite me to a wedding. Instead, I drove to a high-end dealership and traded in my peeling silver Honda Civic for a 2024 jet black Porsche 911 Carrera with Bordeaux red leather interior and a sport exhaust system that roared with a guttural, mechanical defiance. The smell of the new leather was sharp and expensive, a fragrance of personal victory that I inhaled deeply as I began the long scenic drive toward a quiet 5-acre plot in the mountains of Colorado I had purchased with the remaining liquidated funds. The cabin was a masterpiece of slate, cedar, and glass, tucked away in a valley where the only sounds were the wind through the ponderosa pines and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk, a world away from the humid, judgmental air of the Georgia coast. I spent my first evening there sitting on a wraparound deck made of reclaimed timber, the cool mountain air biting at my skin as I pulled my phone out one last time to address the wreckage I had left behind. I created a final group chat including my parents and Belle, my fingers steady as I typed a message that was as brief as a military dispatch. The bank is closed. Permanent leave granted. Do not contact me again. I hit send and immediately deactivated the SIM card, tossing the tiny piece of plastic into the stone fire pit where a small blaze of cedar logs was already turning to white ash. I leaned back in my chair, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the Rockies, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange that no influencer's filter could ever hope to replicate. I had spent my entire life being the reliable one, the shadow that provided the light for others to shine, but in the silence of the Colorado wilderness, I realized that I was finally the protagonist of my own story. My family had wanted a ghost and I had given them exactly what they asked for. A woman who was no longer visible, no longer reachable, and no longer willing to pay for the privilege of being ignored. Family is not defined by the blood you share, but by the respect you are given, and as I watched the final embers of my old life fade into the night, I knew that the only person I owed anything to was the woman sitting in the black Porsche, driving toward a future that belonged entirely to her. I sat on the expansive wraparound deck of my Colorado cabin, the weathered cedar planks still radiating the last of the afternoon's high-altitude heat against the soles of my feet as the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains began to cut a violet silhouette against a sky of bruised orange and deep gold. In my right hand I swirled a heavy lead crystal tumbler containing 2 fingers of a 20-year-old Macallan sherry oak. The liquid a rich mahogany that caught the dying light like a liquid gemstone and smelled of dried fruits, ginger, and the quiet triumph of a war finally won. The silence here was a physical presence, a dense and sacred weight that was no longer interrupted by the frantic vibrations of a phone or the suffocating guilt of 1,000 unearned demands. And for the first time in 31 years, I could hear the steady rhythmic beating of my own heart without the static of someone else's crisis. I watched the golden light retreat from the valley floor, thinking about the sterile office at Luke Air Force Base and the peeling silver paint of the Honda Civic that now belonged to a past life, realizing that I had traded a world of filtered lies for a reality that was as sharp and cold as the mountain air. The $89,000 in profit from their dissolved vanities had bought me more than a Porsche or a cabin. It had purchased the absolute right to be unreachable, a luxury more profound than any VERA WANG gown or coastal-themed gala could ever provide. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the scotch, feeling the smooth heat of the peat and oak coat my throat, and I leaned back into the Adirondack chair with the profound, heavy relaxation of a commanding officer who had finally completed her final mission. My mother, my father, and Belle were now just distant echoes in a valley I had already evacuated, their frantic attempts to reclaim their bank teller falling into the void I had created by simply choosing to exist for myself. I was no longer the fixer of broken transmissions, the financier of luxury condos, or the invisible ghost who paid the bills for a family that viewed my strength as a stylistic flaw. I was the sole owner of my time, my rank, and my future. The hyperrealistic details of my previous life, the cost of knee surgeries, the price of champagne, and the weight of debt, had been reconciled and closed like a flight log at the end of a long deployment, leaving me with a clean slate and a horizon that didn't require anyone's permission to explore. I looked out at the first stars beginning to pierce the thinning atmosphere, feeling the sheer, unadulterated weight of my own autonomy, and I understood that the most beautiful aesthetic in the world isn't found in a botanical garden or a designer showroom, but in the brutal, honest clarity of a life lived without leeches. Family is a word that had been weaponized against me for 3 decades to keep me in line and in debt. But as the darkness swallowed the mountains and the embers in my fire pit glowed a deep, defiant red, I knew that I had finally redefined the term to include only the person currently sitting on this deck. I had cut away the rot with the surgical precision of a pilot and the cold heart of a businesswoman, and the result was this perfect, expensive, and hard-earned silence that I finally deserved. The bank was closed, the accounts were settled, and as I finished the last drop of the Macallan, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the next emergency, because there was no one left to call for help. I was the storm that had passed, and in the wake of the destruction, I had found the only thing that actually mattered. A home where the only voice I had to listen to was my own.